Hello and welcome to the Max Chroma YouTube channel. In this channel, I will show you all of the things I've learned over the years about color in computer graphics, especially within the program Adobe Photoshop, which I have the most experience with when it comes to graphic design and color. First, we're going to open the latest version I have installed of Photoshop, which is Adobe Photoshop CC 2019. I'm going to open up also a color test file that I've created for use in this particular video, which is going to show you the HSB Color Layers action that I've just released on Adobe Exchange and on my PayHip site. So let me go ahead and drag this test file, which I'll put on my Creative Cloud at the end of this video, and put it in the About section of this YouTube video. With this color test file, and having no actions loaded in my panel, or I could have other actions in there, but not this one in particular, I'm going to go up to Window, Find Extensions on Exchange. Now on Adobe Exchange, it should go automatically to Photoshop Extensions, and the third one over here, because I just put it up, is HSB Color Layers. Now I've already acquired this extension. It is free for all users. Up here in the corner you would say Get Extension or Acquire, and what it would do is automatically download this action file into your Downloads folder. So let's say we have the action file in the Downloads folder. And I'm going to go ahead to that right here. Okay, what would show up first is just this action file called HSB Color Layers, and it wouldn't have any version information in that. What I have done is updated it to 1.0.1. But this first version, I'm going to double click. Just simply double clicking it will install it to my Actions panel. Now what I can do with this image right here is run this action, and it'll split into HSB color layers. That's hue, saturation, and brightness. Now you may be familiar with hue, saturation, and brightness when you're picking colors. In the color picker, there's an H, S, and B value. And you can also look up some more information about hue, saturation, and brightness online if you want to know more, or follow some of my future videos. I'll go in further depth about this. Photoshop does have a built-in method of doing image adjustments with what is called hue, saturation, and lightness. So on this image, I can enhance the saturation or decrease it and everything becomes gray. I can change the lightness, darker or brighter, to white. I can shift the hues around. Okay. There's also, under Filter, Other, HSB, HSL, a way to split this image into the hue, saturation, and brightness, or hue, saturation, and lightness channels. One thing about this built-in feature that seems to be a little confusing at first is when you convert the HSB, you have an input and an output. So you can go RGB is the input, this is RGB channels, and then the output or row order is going to be HSB for this. Now when I hit OK, you'll notice all of the colors in my document have changed. But over in the channels view, there's now a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel that are much different from what they were in RGB. The issue is that these are still composited as if they are green and blue and red channels. So this does not show the original colors of the document, but it has split into essentially the red is our hue, the green is our saturation, and the blue is our brightness. Now you can go ahead and say Filter, HSB, HSL, Input Mode HSB, output RGB, and it will bring these back into the original, what it looked like before, changing those red, green, and blue channels into true RGB additive mixture to create the original image. But let's say we wanted to work within the HSB mode, but within RGB and seeing a true composite. Okay, I'm going to revert this document. So there is a way. If I go Filter, Other, HSB, HSL, Input Mode RGB, Output HSB. Okay. And let's say I just want the saturation. Well, I could select all, copy this over, press copy, Control C, come over to the RGB channels and Control V, paste it as a new layer. So there's the saturation. I could turn that layer off, go back to the background, choose the blue channel, select that, and this would be my brightness. Back to RGB, Control V, paste in a new layer. But how do we get this hue to become full color as RGB? So there's a way to basically eliminate all of the saturations and brightnesses. Let's fill this with white on the green channel or the saturation. Let's go to the blue or the brightness channel it is, fill that with white. Now we really just have the hue in here. So if I go ahead and do Filter, HSB, HSL, Input HSB, Output RGB, and bring that back over, it's only going to bring the hue over. And it says, it'll see that there's really nothing in the saturation and brightness that we filled with white. So this is the hue underneath all of that saturation and brightness. Now how to recreate that? Well, we basically can take this layer, which was our saturation. Okay, so this is going to be the hue. This next layer is the saturation. And essentially that's like fading out all the colors to where they were gray or black or white. So I'm going to invert this, Control I, and then set that to screen. Screen blend mode. That will simulate the desaturation of the hues. The next layer is our brightness. And if we set this to multiply blend mode, that will recreate the original graphic as 3 separate color layers of the hue, the saturation, and the brightness. So now we're looking at hue, saturation, and brightness within RGB mode, but as 3 layers that create the composite of the original image. But we can go ahead and now work with those layers in any way we want to. And also, the true key to this method is we get access to the hues underneath all of that other information. What I've just shown you is what this action, which I've released for free, because it's such a simple method of recreating what should really already be there in the HSB split mode, and it just recreates all of that. Now, one of the things that happened, I'm going to revert this document and show you. So from a flat image, we can go ahead and run this action. But in version 1.0.0, I didn't account for the fact you could have a locked layer or locked background layer. So if I run this, it's going to cause an error. Okay, it'll stop and say the command select is not currently available. Okay, let's close that and let's do file revert. Or this, essentially the first thing I do in this action is duplicate the document, so it doesn't affect your original document. Now what's going on here is I would have to, in version 1.0.0, which you can get on the Adobe Exchange. Now I've uploaded a 1.0.1 version. It should be approved shortly. But if you want to get the 1.0.1 update, you can also go to payhip.com/maxchroma, and you can get this product here, which is my HSB Color Layers. It's the same action file, but it's completely free. So you can simply download it, enter your email address, continue, and download that action for free. If you want to wait for Adobe Exchange to approve the 1.0.1 update, then you can do it there. To avoid that error if you have the 1.0.0 file, just simply double click your background layer. It can be named whatever you want, just no longer locked. And if you have other layers in there that are locked, you would have to either unlock those layers or simply flatten your image, double click to make it no longer a locked background. Now if I press play on this action, or you can go to button mode and it simply operates as a button, clicking this HSB Color Layers will perform the same steps I showed you just a minute ago manually using the filter Other HSB HSL. That's the reason I'm putting this action out for free, because I feel that this should just be built into Photoshop automatically, showing you in color. Now I'm going to click this. It's going to run through those operations and leave us with the hue, the saturation, and the brightness as 3 color layers. Let's go ahead and, so you can see really underneath, let's say just in this red, underneath all of this black shading and grayness and this white desaturation and tinting, all these tints and midtones and shades, underneath those really is all of that hue. Okay, if you go to the original document and we just eyedrop this, let's go up to this red. Let's go ahead and get the color picker, use the eyedropper. So you'll notice that this basically follows the color picker. This is all going to stay within what's a 0 degree or red hue. Okay, so really even down into the darkest shades, there's still hue component being detected in this color. So when we go here and we turn off the brightness and the saturation layer, you can see that the pure hues are really present underneath all of the shading and tinting of any image. This is due to the nature of how RGB converts to a hue, saturation, and brightness, or other types of color models or color spaces, which we'll go into further detail in other videos. Now, one of the other things about, let me just close this document, go back to the original. One of the other things about the 1.0.0 version of this action is there was also a little bit of an error about handling transparencies. Okay, so given that I have this not a background locked layer or other locked layers, and I want to, let's just erase some of this so there's transparency there, okay? Some transparency built into the original. If I run this and let it result in the original 1.0.0 version, it's going to rebuild it, but there's going to be a little bit of issues going on in the transparency that's different from the original transparency. So it's kind of combined it 3 times. The solution for this is to actually apply the transparency mask to a group. So I made those updates right away because I realized I had uploaded the action without accounting for those few cases. And let's go ahead and revert this file. I'm going to take my actions out of button mode. I'm going to just delete this from there. And let's say I downloaded the 1.0.1.atn HSB Color Layers 1.0.1 action file either from the update on Adobe Exchange or from the PayHip site. Okay, I'm going to double click this. It's now going to load in here, and this is the 1.0.1. So now I can have a locked background layer. I can have other layers in here that are on or off. Some of them can be locked. And I can also have some transparency built in here. Let's go ahead and erase some of this. And we'll go ahead and lock that again. So now I can run this and it won't stop with any locked layers. And it'll also recreate the transparency exactly as it was. So you see now we have a group called HSB Color Layers group. And the transparency mask is now over that whole group. We can turn off the transparency. You can see even under transparency, a lot of information from the original document tends to be retained, depending on how many levels of destruction you've gone through the transparency mask. Okay, we have the brightness, the saturation, and the hue. But now it's all recomposited as a group, and it shows the transparency the same as the original. Okay, we can arrange this 2 up, and we can see that it's identical. Okay, let me just close this. Let's take this and revert it. Okay, so you've seen what the HSB Color Layers action does, how it works. You could recreate it the same steps yourself following this video using the filter other HSB HSL method. But the action is free, and you can just run this action on anything that you have in Photoshop. And in case you had a multi-layered file with a whole bunch of work that you've done, it's always going to duplicate to a new document called Max Chroma HSB Color Layers, so as not to destroy or damage any work you've already done. It's also going to turn this into 16-bit. Now I will go into further depth in other videos about 16-bit versus 8-bit, but in this video I think you can follow it quite easily. When I run this action, we'll notice that not under every hue is it capturing all of that color perfectly. Okay, let's go ahead and look over at the other hues. Okay, and these are all, you can eyedrop and see this is now 10 degrees. It's all going to go along this color bar or color circle. Okay, we can see there's some sort of artifacts or noise going on here. So let's go ahead and zoom in, and I'll turn off the pixel grid. Okay, I don't want to see the pixel grid here. So we can see that there's some sort of artifact going on where it thinks that this, underneath all of this saturation and brightness of what is essentially an orange hue, 30 degrees, okay, underneath that, in 16-bit, we have what is essentially some noise, where further down into the shades, it starts to think that is this actually a reddish orange or a yellowish orange, okay, and to the point where it actually switches from pure red to pure yellow. We'll get into this kind of stuff in future videos in more depth as to why this happens. It has to do with the nature of RGB converting to HSB. With red or green, if we go ahead and look at this, with red, yellow, green, you'll notice pure red right here. This is what happens underneath where there's absolutely no color information. It's still going to think that it's a 0 hue. Okay, and we can account for that in other methods in the future. But it gets covered up essentially by a pure black or pure gray or white. Okay, anything that's absolutely neutral with no hue in it will end up as this 0 hue. Under the green, the cyan, the blue, we see that there is none of that noise, that color noise. It's only in some of the middle hues, okay, the orange, okay, it's in the lime here, okay, happens also here, the mint, the azure blue, okay, you can see it start to switch from blue to cyan. Part of this is the way that the Photoshop HSB HSL filter is working. And I have another action that I'm going to put out shortly that accounts for some of that error. But also, this kind of stuff gets worse and worse when you start going into 8-bit, or especially into JPEG. So first I'm just going to show you that with another file. So I'm going to close this file. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open, I have the HSB Color Squares test file 8-bit. So let's go ahead and load that in here. Process this. Okay, if we look at that hue, you can see under 8-bit it is much, much worse what's happening here. All of this noise where it's getting confused in the middle hues. And in fact, some of that is even showing up a little bit under these pure hues. Okay. And then the next step further, which this all leads to, essentially I'm showing this whole thing as opening the door into something that most people have never really seen before in their images. Now I've got a JPEG file, which I saved very, very low bitrate JPEG. And we can already see there's some destruction going on in the color when you save a JPEG. It's trying to compress things and essentially account for all this color. Now, generally when it's recomposited with the saturation and brightness or in full RGB, you don't notice this as much, and JPEG does work for creating very small files that appear similar to your vision as the original file. But JPEG really destroys the color underneath everything. And so if I run the HSB Color Layers on this JPEG 8-bit file, we'll notice underneath the brightness and the saturation that the hues have really been blocked up by their pixels. See, they're not the same as the pixel grid. The hues have essentially become extremely low resolution. Okay, let's go ahead and turn off that pixel grid. And underneath these, even the primary hues, we have colors shifting, okay, as well as the intermediate hues. This is all to show you, when I go and look at some photographs, why there can be lots of noise and artifacts in the hue when you're looking at hue, saturation, and brightness. Let's go ahead and close that and close this. Now let's go ahead and just look at a few different color photographs, okay, using the HSB Color Layers action. So here's a nice photograph of a flower, a violet. Go ahead and click that. And we're going to see it looks like the original, okay? But we have a brightness layer, a saturation layer, and the hue, okay? And we can see underneath all of that what hue this is, okay? And we have right around 265. If we get to about 270, 260, that's about a pure violet, okay? 240 is blue. And you'll see a lot of this is around 250, 264, okay? Roses are red, violets are blue. They do have some violet in them though. Now, what happens is when you apply this saturation to a blue hue, it really starts to look purple, and that's just the nature of HSB itself. It's not a perfect color model or color system. With certain hues like 60 degrees yellow, this is a pure yellow, as you start to go shaded down, it will take on a greenish color, greenish tint to your eyes. And with the blue at 240 degrees, when it starts to tint to white, it will take on a sort of violet appearance. Okay, and then when we put the brightness back over, which is essentially how bright all those are, it recreates the original. Let's go ahead and just look at a few more examples before we end this video. Here's another flower. I'm going to run HSB Color Layers. And again, with the 1.0.1 version, it did not matter. I had a locked background layer. Okay, so look at this underneath the brightness, the saturation. We have all of this hue from this flower, and even some of the greens, yellows from the background. Okay, but again, you can see that there's some of this noise, and this is from the JPEG. Okay, the JPEG algorithm is blocking up some of these hues into chunks and creating some noise in some of these areas. Okay, but where there's a lot of detail, it tends to hold some of that hue detail. Now, I believe I'll get to this in some future videos. You can really do anything you want with these layers, and since they're no longer in channels and they're showing in color, you really can work with your artwork. So I could go to the saturation and adjust the levels of this, okay, to increase the saturation more or less. Okay, we can go to the brightness. Maybe let's go ahead and do some curves adjustments. Okay, lighten the brightness, darken it. And you can even go to the hue, and normally with a full color image, you can just open up the HSL and adjust your master hue in different ways. Or you could select just one hue region and change it. I'll go into the HSL tool in other videos. But with this access to this hue, you really could do much more to this than just a simple hue shift. You could really do a lot of artistic things to this and then recombine it. And again, this just uses blend modes of screen and multiply to recreate the original. Let's go ahead and close this. Try another test image. Okay, here's a sunset on a dock. Go ahead and, again, we can play the action right here or use it in button mode and just click it. Okay, now we have underneath this brightness and this saturation. You can see almost all of this image is in the reds, oranges, and a little bit of yellow. And again, we have to be careful. What this red right here is not underneath. It's not that the sun is red. It's that it's a pure white, but it's reading as that 0 hue. I have another action that will essentially just put a white there and a black in the blackest areas to recreate this hue in a way that kind of makes more sense. You know, if you take this saturation and maybe threshold it. And we take this brightness, we threshold it. Okay, you can kind of see what the real hues are in the image, apart from where they get washed out to pure white or pure black. In certain cameras, in raw mode, you'll notice it's a pink underneath things like the purest whites. And in another video, I will show a different action that automatically does this. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that. Close this. We'll go to another example. Here we have a picture of a church, and these photographs I got off the website Pixabay, and we could go to that site. Okay. Pixabay.com, and I actually have an account here. I have one image loaded. It's a color wheel, HWB color wheel. But on the Pixabay site, there's all sorts of images you can download, and they are royalty free, and so you can use them for all these kinds of things, any purpose. But you know, I like to use them to explain these color situations and how to work with color in Photoshop and other programs. Okay, so again, I'm going to play the HSB Color Layers action on this photo of a church. And we can see that there's all of this color going on in here, but it's affected by the brightness and the saturation. But we can turn off the brightness, turn off the saturation, and see what's really happening with all of this color information. Okay, and you might say, why is all of this orange? It really has to do with the color of the lighting and how light bounces and reflects off things and where it's coming in, what color the objects are, plus the majority color of the lighting itself. Okay, you can see the stained glass windows have lots of variation in color, and you can see that here. Okay, right there. There's the hues. So essentially, this whole video and this action file is to introduce anyone that watches my YouTube channel or is interested in this level of color to the word hue, what hue is in terms of graphics and digital color, and how you can actually see all of the hues underneath an image. And this really opens the doorway to all my future videos and the work that I do in really digging down into color of an image and capturing all of the tints, tones, and shades of the color of your image, not just splitting it to hue, saturation, and brightness. In another video, I'll talk about hue, whiteness, and blackness, HWB, which is a color model that the same inventor of HSB created later on as sort of a correction or an improvement on the HSB method. Let's go ahead and close this image. Okay. Now, what you can do these days that's really fun is you can take raw images if you have a smartphone or a DSLR camera, digital camera, you can get raw images that translate in as 16-bit. So here I've got a photo of a printout I did of one of my color wheels. So this is an inkjet print onto some glossy photo paper. It's hung on the wall. And I took this photo with my camera phone, my smartphone, and I made sure to capture a raw image. So I put it in Pro mode and captured a raw version, not just a JPEG version. So if I play this, we're going to see that there's not so much, I'll turn off the brightness layer and saturation, there's not so much of the noise or the destruction going on that you end up with an 8-bit or JPEG file. And it really sees hue under most of this, but right underneath this glare, it's turning that to a red as a 0 hue, so it just ends up becoming red when it's really not. It's just pure white with a 0 for hue showing up, totally desaturated. But we can also see that the hues do follow some of this color wheel method, but within some of these, the printout itself, the inkjet print, really shifted the hue a little bit. Okay, and also we can see that the inkjet was putting blue into most of the grays. Okay, most of this gray in this color wheel has a cool gray or a cool type of tint to it, done with using some blues from the inkjet printer. But really you can see there's not so much of that noise. There's a little bit in here, but it's not the color destruction noise from the JPEGing. Okay, let's go ahead and look at a few more. These are some raw photographs. Some of these I took myself, and some I got from a website called wesaturate.com. It's a website that gives you access to a bunch of raw photo images for you to do color adjustments to. Okay, so again, this photograph under the HSB Color Layers. And then we can see that under the brightness and the saturation, the entire sky is actually showing as pretty much a perfect 210-degree azure blue. Azure, I don't really know the right way to say it. Now we have a little bit of graininess, I would call it, and that's from the sensor of the camera itself not being quite perfect in capturing the hue. Okay, you can see it's in a certain direction. If I held my phone vertically, I would get it in the other direction. So it's definitely something to do with the camera sensor, and not all cameras behave the same way when you get down into the hue like this. Okay, but you can see that there's some greens for the trees, and I'll just put the saturation and brightness back on. If I turn the saturation off, you can see how this is the brightness of all those hues. Turn the saturation on without the brightness, and that's the desaturation of all those hues. So really the sky is basically a desaturated but very bright azure blue. Okay, but again, I call this kind of a revealed hue technique, where we can get down and see what is the color or the hues underneath everything in our images. Let's go ahead with this. Press play on this action again. Okay, let's turn off the brightness, saturation. We can see all of that hue under that. Now you can tell, okay, this might be a somewhat gray painting on the deck, but that's actually got a lot of blue hue going onto it, azure blue. And again, the white areas have been turned to 0 hue, so it's not quite accurate with this method as to where the most washed out hues, if they're truly just white and no color under there, it should get turned to white. But I wanted to provide this action as a simple method of taking the HSB channels that Photoshop will give you when you run this filter, bringing them over to color layers, and recompositing it accurately to show the original. Another test image. Now this is one of the ones I got off of wesaturate.com. Okay, and I'm just going to do, what you want to do here is click on this, make sure it's going to come in as 16 bits per channel. Okay. We won't go into the sRGB versus Adobe RGB stuff just yet. Leave that for some other videos. Now this looks very faded and desaturated, and yes, you can go to adjustments, hue, saturation, start to bring up the saturations, but you'll never quite get under all of that brightness and desaturation. It really only affects the grays when you use the HSL saturation. It does not change the tints or the shades. So let's just go ahead and hit play on this and see the HSB color layers of this photograph. Turn off the brightness, the saturation. Okay, you can see that there's all this shifting of the orange, yellow, green, blue from the sun in the sky. And then that also gets reflected off of the river. So you can see the sky being reflected in the river in the hues. And if we zoom in here, you can see that this actually is seeing the hues of some of these cars. Okay, these are just a few pixels in this image, maybe some taxis, you know, it's picking up the hue of these. Now this looks almost like an infrared or thermal heat map of the image, but it's really not. It's not the heat, it is the hues that are being detected by the camera. It's not always the actual hue of the object. A lot of it has to do with the lighting in general and which cast the lighting is taking, if it's going, you know, more towards darker shadows or cooler, bluer colors or warmer. The lighting in the room can have a lot of effect on this. Okay, so we can see this is a sign on a building. Okay, let's just go ahead and close this and move on to the other examples. Okay, this one we're going to go ahead and open image. Press play. And we can see underneath all of this shading, again, there's a lot of hue. And here's what I'm talking about with the sunset creating all this orange and red. And then where the other background lighting from the sky is reflecting off of this water, it's not going to catch the reflection of the sunlight in the oranges, yellows, reds. It's going to catch the reflection of the skylight. Okay, and give you some of those blues and cyans. Next image. Now some images will have detail in the hue where you can still see and make out certain objects. And again, this looks like this is very faded white underneath all that in the background. The green of the trees and this wooden pathway. But let's go ahead and run this action. Go to button mode again. Turn off the brightness and the saturation. You can see that you can actually follow, and this is what happens a lot in the hues of photographs, is that the red will be in the shadows of this object and the yellow will be in the highlights. So the hues kind of bend around on certain objects because of shading and highlighting. But you can also see that there's green being detected underneath all of this in the background of these pine trees. Right? And it's even picking up some of the colors of the branches being not necessarily green, but shades of brown, which fall into the orange. And then this understanding, which we'll go into more depth in future videos, of course, the understanding of hue of objects, and that every object tends to have some sort of hue cast to it, is that these light browns here, see, they're actually in the orange hue. Okay, same with these, they're in the orange. These dark brown color, you'd call it, or a grayish brown, and it's in the reddish orange hues. Okay. So again, this is to inform and educate that there's a lot of information that's being overlooked in the hue of any photograph or image or artwork. And once we have access to that visually, it kind of opens up another world for us to investigate and really dig down into what is color, what is it made of, how is it recorded and created and captured and reproduced, and then using that information, that understanding, what kind of things can we do to dig into the tints and tones and shades of color, not just the pure hues and their saturation or brightness. Okay, but again, you can see something that's very interesting. In this image, it looks like a very smooth fade of the sky over to here. But you can see, okay, it's got a little bit of bluish tint. Over here, some orange tint. But we don't really see a sharp line in the middle. It's because it's really fading all the way through a very white, desaturated. You can see just how much saturation is in here. And there's like a really, like a line right here of desaturation that almost makes that pure white. You can see the brightness just kind of fades one to the other. But underneath that, the hue really sharply bends. It's all blues over here, and then it jumps right over to the oranges. Okay, so that's really what's going on, is being picked up by the sensor and the camera, is that there's this kind of hue gradient to the sky. And sometimes it's softer in certain images. You'll see more of the greens in there that you're not quite sure that you see sometimes, but there can be a real faded green going on in the sunset or the sun gradient of the sky photo. And we can see the orange light of the sun is reflecting off of this hill and definitely casting everything in that orange. Okay, but we're still getting some of the greens of the grass. Okay, and underneath this really dark green, it's truly very, very bright. Okay, pure, like lime green, 90 degrees. Okay, 110 gets over, starts to go over towards the pure green, 120. Okay. And then with this final test image, this one's really cool. I'm going to open this up. Okay, and this is some street and sign lighting, and probably somewhere in Japan, I think. I'm not quite sure. Running that action, you can see, there's the brightnesses, here's the saturations, okay, and here's the hue. So in this photograph, there's really all of that color going on in these different signs. Okay, and here's what's interesting. In this one, you really can read a lot of this. Well, I can't really read a lot of this, but you can read some of this, and you can see that it's details and legible. And there's lots of details going on in the color. Okay. So there's just lots of color stuff going on, a lot of color information. Okay, all being picked up in this photograph. And just looking at it like that, it's even just kind of a cool, what I call a max chromograph of your image, is to just look at the hue underneath everything. So this video I'm going to conclude. And we'll have future videos that go into further depth into other color modes, other actions that I have, other types of methods and approaches that I take to digging down into the color. But I really want as many users as possible to understand and see and have access to something like this hue, saturation, and brightness. But again, if we just run the filter, other, HSB, HSL, RGB to HSB, by default it changes all of the colors around because it's showing in RGB composited channels. So it's really a false representation of the split to HSB. Here I've just bounced it over to color layers, and now you can really see what the hue is underneath all of that saturation and brightness. Thank you for watching this video. And I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the description to where you can get the action file on Adobe Exchange. Okay, you can go to payhip.com/maxchroma and see my products there. You can go to the Adobe Exchange and go to Max Chroma. Look for this HSB Color Layers or search Max Chroma, and you can probably get access to my page here. And I'll also put in the description a link to that color test file, the HSB Color Squares test file, and my HWB Color Wheel image. Okay, have a great day, and I'll look forward to informing as much as possible, educating, and having lots of fun with color in future videos.